Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. There are 12 million people born in Mexico living in the United States, and some 36 million people of Mexican descent. It's one of the largest diasporas in the world. Nearly all maintain ties to their mother country, whether it's through the money they send home, the calls to relatives in Mexico, the music they listen to, or the news they read. But governments are slow to create policies and practices. On today's program, we'll be talking about the organized efforts of migrant population to make their voices heard in both countries, their home country and their host country. And to do that, we're very happy to have with us here in the studio Oscar Chacón. Oscar is the executive director of Alianza Americas, a coalition of migrant organizations across the United States. Oscar, thanks so much for being with us here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Lara.
Oscar, you are here in Mexico for a rather unusual event, which is a forum of the migrant population with Mexico's presidential candidates. What was the goal of setting up this forum?
Well, you said it right. I mean, it's a very unusual, I would even say unprecedented event in which migrant-led organizations take the initiative in actually convening a forum with candidates running for president in Mexico, and do so in conjunction with a bunch of allies also in Mexico that are interested in actually having the migrant voices become more active in basically, I would say, the civic democratic engagement that needs to happen more in Mexico, and it cannot possibly live out, the voices of the 12 million people that you were referring to just a minute ago.
So what kind of allies are these? Are these organized family members or NGOs?
It's a collection of organizations. It includes first and foremost organizations that are actually working with population who have been deported, populations who remain very constantly in contact with their counterparts in the US, so basically families, relatives, associations, also indigenous organizations that actually work on both sides of the border.
Oh, there are tribes that span the border.
Yes, indeed. And it also includes academic institutions. It includes civil society organizations more invested in promoting the culture of democracy in Mexico. So again, I mean, it's a broad range of organizations that are partnering with immigrant-led groups. But what's important to note is that the idea of this particular candidates forum is born, within a bunch of Mexican organizations which happen to be members of Alianza Americas.
So these organizations got together on both sides of the border. Was it just at the moment of coming up with this idea of the forum, or is this work that's been going on for a while?
No, it's actually work that has a longer history than just the presidential election that is about to happen in Mexico. It goes back to essentially the beginnings of the previous decade, which was a decade in which we learned for the first time that people of Latin American origin were actually the largest ethnic group after white people in the US. And not only that, but we also learned that back then in the year 2000, foreign-born immigrants in Latin America were actually about 40% of all of the Latino population back in the year 2000. It's gone down a little bit since then, but it remains very solidly at least 1/3 of the overall Latino population in the country.
Major demographic changes.
Indeed, very much significant.
And was that something that spurred you to think there's political power here in addition to the numbers?
People like me, who were part of the founders of Alianza Americas, which in the early days was actually called National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, what we envisioned was the fact that these populations who had come to be at the very same time in which the technology revolution changed the way we think about identity, the way we think about space, the way we communicate, inter-country communication, which I believe has made possible for the first time to have a large number of people who have a very natural, organic way of connecting with both places at the same time. It is significant in Mexico, but not unique to Mexico. You also see it in Central American countries. And so the potential that we saw was that this community, we did not need to convince them about the importance of a transnational way of thinking about everything, because they were already living with that form of doing things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when we look at the Mexicans, there are Mexicans in the United States who've lived there for decades.
Yes.
Their children were born there. Why does Mexican politics matter to them?
Well, I mean, people go back to the basic question of why did I leave? You know, that's a very defining question for most people who have become migrants, not exclusively from Mexico, but clearly Mexicans being the largest group of foreign nationals in the US today. This is a question that resonates very deeply with Mexicans. Mexicans always say, you know, if I had had opportunities back home, if I had had a good job, if my kids had an insurance that they would go to school and succeed, I would not have left, you know, because people love the place they are born, people love their countries, people love their own culture. And the only reason why we become migrants is because opportunities were denied, and people believe that there were opportunities somewhere else. So that's why the question of why local politics in the home country remains very important.
So these connections that are still deep in the heart, especially have generated, at least among part of this population, a certain influence, a certain interest in influencing what's happening back in their home country. I imagine that they also have family members on this side of the border.
Indeed. I mean, there are still plenty of instances where half of the family is here and the other half, you know, is in the US. I think that the potential to use the leverage that comes from the fact that Mexicans in the US in particular send so much money home. You know, when you think of the gross domestic product in Mexico, it is still roughly 4.5%, maybe 5% of all of the gross national product. But when you look by state, you know, these numbers are amazing. And so 25, 27, $28 billion, it's a lot of money. You know, when people say we need to please investors in Mexico so that they can be better with Mexico, I always argue, you know, that means actually treating your own foreign nationals residing abroad much better than we ever had, because those are the most loyal investors that Mexico has.
Yeah, most people haven't thought about it that way.
I'm sure they haven't.
And yet remittances are actually a larger source of income than oil in the last year.
Very much so, and when you look at how much Mexicans have moved forward in terms of basic measures of social well-being, like access to education, access to healthcare, access to a much better housing unit, you know, I would argue that whatever the Mexican government has done has been useful and important, but I would give more credit to Mexicans outside the Mexican territory who have made possible for these changes to actually happen. And it's easy to assume that this is all to be given credit, you know, to Mexican administrations, but I would argue that immigrants themselves in the US have been essential players in changing also the face of poverty in Mexico.
The hidden development factor.
Yeah, or at the very least, you know, I'm not so sure if it is the hidden development factor, but definitely the hidden propeller of coming out of poverty.
Yeah, poverty eradication, and the government doesn't really factor that in.
No, not that I know. They don't really factor in the way they should.
Well, going back to the policy sphere, one of the problems that we've had is that, especially lately, the issue of immigration, and it tends to get defined by the United States as the receiving or the gatekeeper country in this case, has been firmly placed in the realm of national security, making it a domestic policy issue. And yet, you talked about the transnational lives. We look at what the real causes and effects are, and they're clearly international. How do you break down some of these policy barriers so that we can begin to confront the issue in an integral way?
Well, I mean, it's going to be a long undertaking in terms of time to see results. I definitely believe that we have a serious underdevelopment when it comes to the political tools, the political systems that should be driving the way we talk about human mobility, the way we talk about migration, the way we talk about national sovereignty. But frankly, we are still using tools that are largely coming from 40, 50 years ago to define a problem that is really completely different today than the case was, going back 50 years ago. And I think that the change is demanding from both a country like Mexico, but also a country like the US. Because in the US, as we all know, the very successful appeal that the current occupant of the White House did in terms of using nationalism, national sovereignty, national security to basically mobilize an important base of voters to precisely get him to become president, played a role. And unless we are able to redefine how we should be thinking in an age of global interconnectedness, issues like migration and human mobility, I think we're going to continue to see rather negative episodes of this rage that tends to be discharged against foreign nationals as if they were really the party that we should blame for the problems that people have not only in the US, but also in Mexico.
Well, let's talk about Donald Trump. Beyond the rhetoric about the wall every other day and the statements about the invading hordes practically in terms of the way he portrays immigration, what kind of an impact have you seen among your members?
Well, I can tell you that fear is definitely increased. There is more fear even to board a bus. For example, people who used to feel confident, boarding a bus or a train are not so confident anymore because they can literally, be stopped and ask for their papers.
They're raiding public transportation.
Yes, I mean, take, for example, Amtrak. I mean, it was never the case up until probably 5 years ago or so that anybody would come into a train and actually ask people to show their documentation. Or buses.
Yeah, right, there was just a recent Greyhound case.
Indeed,
on that.
Exactly. And so, and yet I can assure you that we are not yet seeing the worst part of what it will mean to have these particular people in the White House. I would like to call attention in particular to the dangers surrounding the person who happens to be the Attorney General in the US. This is someone, Jeff Sessions, who absolutely is driven by a very clear desire to ensure that no people that they consider undesirable come in, and equally committed to getting out of the country people that they consider undesirable. And they are working really hard, preparing the groundwork to ensure that the law that is now in place, I'm referring particularly to the changes in immigration law adopted in 1996, which are incredibly mean, incredibly anti-Mexican, if you want, if they are to be applied much more firmly than they've been applied so far, they can do a lot of damage to the immigrant population, especially Mexicans.
So they have a tremendous amount of leeway to crack down without even changing the legal structure.
They don't need to change a single law, frankly, to go much more aggressively against people who, in their view, are lawbreakers, are basically a threat to the security of the US, and therefore they should be back in the country where they were born.
There are a lot of contradictions, though, in this policy within the Trump administration, because on the one hand, you have these Jeff Sessions and a base that is frankly racist and xenophobic and has been manipulated in some ways to project its own insecurities in that way. But on the other hand, you have Donald Trump, the businessman. And they have to know the role of migrants in the U.S. economy. He knows it in his own hotels. How do you think that contradiction will be reconciled in the future? How's that going to play out?
Well, I think that the master plan behind what they are doing is not one about becoming 100% isolationist and not let any foreigner come in anymore. I really don't believe that that is ultimately where they want to go.
Not completely sealing the borders.
Correct. I think that what they want to do is shake the system in such a way that they really curtail, immigration, particularly from countries like Mexico, Central America, Africa, the countries that he basically referred to as places nobody wants to even know about. Countries is the way he described them. But they also want to make sure that they kick out anybody that they believe has broken the law and therefore should not be in the US. And then I believe that what they will do to redeem themselves is to come up with a mega temporary worker visa program that will enable foreign nationals to come back into the U.S. under this type of visa programs, but without any promise whatsoever that they will ever become immigrants in the U.S., that they will ever have a chance to become citizens of the United States, which is a choice that all immigrants who accumulate a certain number of years as a legal permanent resident can certainly opt for, because in their view, the ultimate goal is how do we make access to cheap labor less politically costly. That is kind of the goal ultimately.
Would this be an expansion of the guest worker programs that already exist, or are we talking about something
I think it would
different?
be not only an expansion of what we now have in place, but it would be a diversification of what areas of employment are up for getting temporary worker visas. I would say that the model that the engineers of this system have is what you already see playing out primarily in the Asia context. You know, when you think about where are all the Bangladeshis, the Indonesians, the Filipinos going to work, and what treatment are they getting, even though they are doing so with a visa, that's kind of the model that I believe these people have in mind.
The Mexican diaspora is one of the largest in the world, but we mentioned before that this migration in general over the past 50 years is something that has come to be a major flashpoint, political flashpoint, and also reality for hundreds of thousands of people in one way or another. Yeah. What's happening on the international scene in order to confront this problem?
Well, it's very sad to see how events have turned over the past few years. You may recall the so-called humanitarian crisis that Obama defined as such, referring to the multiple number of unaccompanied children, mainly from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, that made it into the U.S. southern border in June of 2014. Since that time, we have also seen the major exodus of people from Middle Eastern countries, particularly Syria, because of the wars there, and basically coming into Europe. So the way the debate has evolved is frankly very similar to the way it has evolved in the US over the past 25, 30 years. Namely, immigrants and people seeking safe haven are painted as some sort of threat to the countries. And you know, as one who has been involved in the process around the so-called Global Compact on Migration, which is a process that is supposed to end by the end of this year with the adoption of a so-called compact on migration.
A United Nations
It's
process.
a United Nations process, even though it's non-binding once it is adopted. It's supposed to be voluntary. It is a process that is casting serious doubts on whether we are going to go backwards in terms of the universal access to rights that were granted because of all the changes that were adopted in the 1950s. Nowadays, you have many countries, including many European countries, speaking very loudly about the fact that if you are a foreign national living without authorization in a given country, you should have no rights whatsoever.
Not even
no matter
basic
what.
human rights.
No. I mean, that's what's behind the discourse. And they are emphasizing this to say, we don't have a problem, you know, trying to accommodate every way we can people we have authorized to be there, but if you're not authorized to be there, why should we be concerned about any rights for you? And you are hearing countries like Hungary, for example, becoming extremely outspoken on this very extremist line of thought in the very UN. We are also seeing a lot of discourses on the notion of return as a precondition, you know, to actually begin to speak about creating more ways for people to actually migrate legally. So they want to say, basically, if you are living without permission in a given country, you have to go back before we are ever to consider any possibility of more people coming legally anywhere.
And then it's very uncertain whether you make it back.
Very much so. And this is why I feel that it is important for civil society organizations to be much better informed about what this process entails, what may be the consequences in our own countries, in what way may worsen, you know, the situation we already have. So all these are areas where I don't see that there is enough pressure being brought, you know, by civil society actors who do agree that universal human rights should not be something we experience any reversal of fortunes in any way, but on the opposite. I mean, we should be arguing for more universal rights in a moment in history where clearly we do live in a global neighborhood.
What's your organization doing in terms of getting those migrant voices into debates that so directly affect them?
Well, we are there precisely because, going back about 10 years ago, we realized that most of these debates happen without any involvement of migrant-led organizations. Asian organizations, which were dealing with these issues much earlier than we were, have kind of been the only voice that has somewhat consistently been there. But when it comes to Latin Americans, in general, we don't have powerful voices of people who are migrants from Latin America, which, as you said, is one of the largest communities, just the Mexicans alone. We should be a lot more present. We should be a lot more visible, a lot more outspoken.
On the international and the national debate.
Every level of the debate, from the most local, municipal level to the global, conversation, we should be out there making our voices and our proposals be heard, be known. And that's partly what Alianza Americas tries to do. Not enough, because frankly, we wish we could do 10 times more. But at least we are not letting this go without making an effort for our voices to be heard.
Well, tell us how you're organized. We mentioned that there's 53 local organizations that belong to it, a number of different nationalities.
Yes.
What's the structure in the United States?
Well, basically, we are, as you said, a network. This is a network that was founded on the principle of democratic representation. Every organization has a vote when it comes to deciding the political direction of the network. They also elect our leaders, meaning our board of directors, which is very unlike most other organizations. These organizations are not at all uniform. They are very different. Sometimes it is really loose associations of migrants. Sometimes they are multi-million-dollar community-based organizations running multiple programs, but they all have one vote, when it comes to the time of electing or deciding on anything. They go about coming together in Alianza Americas by essentially embracing certain areas of programming that allow us to advance issues such as how do we fight back against the narrative that paint us as some sort of bad news for the country. We are actively pursuing what we call meaningful interaction, which is a way of creating opportunities to talk to worshipers in multiple faith denominations. We also go into colleges, universities, sometimes even high schools, trying to engage people on very basic conversations such as, if you have kids, what do you dream about for your kids? And what is interesting about these issues is that the answers are very much the same. And it's all intended to bring to the forefront the basic humanity of people so that we can recognize each other for our common purposes, our common interests, as opposed to losing sleep or getting angry with one another because of issues such as economic inequality, which clearly migrants have not caused. And this is one of the reasons why so many Americans feel the way they do, because clearly things have changed. Economic inequality is worse today than it's been for almost 100 years.
Wages have stagnated.
Oh, yeah. So there are plenty of reasons that affect us and affect, also US-born individuals. The question is, how can we create opportunities? And we do this by essentially doing tours all the time, within the US, bringing migrant voices to all these spaces that I was telling you. We also bring people from Mexico, from Honduras, from El Salvador in tours in the US.
To talk about why people are leaving.
To talk about why are people still leaving, because nowadays it's very popular to say, oh, we should be helping countries to make their people stay there. But how are people going to stay there when there are still serious problems with violence, citizens, insecurity in their neighborhoods, when there is still poverty, when only a fraction of the people who enter the labor force on a yearly basis has a chance to find a job? So all these are problems that are common between the US and Mexico and Central American countries more than we would care to admit.
So basically, it's getting to know each other on that really basic human level.
Yes.
That's the first step.
Which in our book is the only effective antidote to really fight back against prejudice.
So we're looking at long-term cultural changes.
Yes, indeed. And of course, we care about changes in the law. We care about keeping the law honest. By filing lawsuits whenever we can partner with entities that are more specialized in the field of high-impact litigation. We also do that part, but in the end, we believe that unless we manage to do a dent on changing the way people feel at the level of the mind and the hearts, we will not get too far.
Immigration has been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah.
It's a long-term process. This has been going on and increasing with globalization over the years, but it's been a lot more in the news lately, whether it's Trump's declarations and the center of his campaign, or what's happening with the increase of Central Americans coming from other countries. Do you think there's something qualitative or quantitatively different about this period, or are we just looking at more media attention?
No, I think that there are some really profound defining issues that are at stake. Let me give you an example. In the US, there has always been bad feelings for newcomers. You can go back all the way to colonial times, and it's always been there. Why is it today different? The reason it is different is because today's migrants have the power to redefine the national identity of the US. Because of their fertility rate, it is a matter of time for the US to become a country where white European ancestry people will become less than 50%. That makes a lot of people scared. And when you look at other parts of the world, especially in Europe, where are the majority of the foreign nationals in Europe coming from? They're coming from Northern Africa, they're coming from the Middle East. All these also defies very long existing notions of identity. And I think that this is also at the heart of why the debate is so complex, in addition to the other economic issues I was mentioning.
So we go back to that basic message of accepting cultural diversity and a fundamental humanity for everyone.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Is really a major organizing challenge ahead
of us. It is.
Us.
That's why I said it's a long-term undertaking. It's not going to pay off tomorrow.
Yeah.
So let's arm ourselves with patience.
Well, Oscar Chacón, thank you very much
pleasure.
for joining us.
Nice to be with you here.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.